Morning and welcome to Second Sunday, hosted by the Peace and Social Order Committee of West Falmouth Quaker Meeting. Today is April 10th, 2022, and we acknowledge that we're in Wampanoag land. Our topic today is the beloved border, humanity and hope in a contested land. Our speaker, the author of her new book, The Beloved Border 2021, is Miriam Davidson, a prize-winning Quaker journalist located for 30 years on the border of Arizona and Mexico. She brings more than 30 years of reporting on the borderlands. As a Quaker journalist based in Tucson, Arizona, she will discuss her book on border issues, published September 2021 by the University of Arizona Press. The Beloved Border describes the work of a Quaker researcher and activists, as well as the Quaker influence of ideas like sanctuary and nonviolence in helping shape the future of the U.S. Mexico border region. She has won awards for the New York Times, the Progressive, The Nation, and many other outlets. Her previous two books were published at the University of Arizona Press: Convictions of the Heart, Jim Corbett and the Sanctuary Movement, and Lives Online, Dispatches from the U.S. Mexican Border. She attends Pima Friends Tucson meeting and is the daughter of Florence Davison in West Falmouth Quaker meeting, and there's no nepotism here. Thank you. Welcome, Miriam Davidson.
Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Very well.
Great.
Yes.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, our people are not looking at me though, so sorry about that, but I'm glad we got the connection. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start talking, but if there's problems with the audio, just let me know, okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks, Mom, Sonny, and my name's Miriam Davidson. I'm the author of The Beloved Border, Humanity and Hope in a Contested Land. And this is my third book about U.S. Mexico border issues. The first book was about Jim Corbett and the Sanctuary Movement. I came to the border in the 1980s to write about Sanctuary, which was a movement among church people and Quakers and others to protect Salvadoran and Guatemalan and other refugees who were fleeing political oppression in Central America in the 1980s. So that's how I've been researching and studying border issues for all these years. And this book, The Beloved Border, is sort of culmination of my understanding of border issues over the last 30 years. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this cover image, which is really beautiful. It's a cross-border picnic that was done by the French artist J.R. in the Baja California border in about 2017. And these are people who are gathering on both sides, the US side on one side and the Mexican side on the other. And I really like this artwork because it's sort of an example and a symbol of cross-border interaction and cooperation to create a work of art. And it's like an ideal of what the border could be. It's also a comment on all the surveillance that's going on the border. There's a whole culture of surveillance there that academics have studied. This photo, the artwork itself, is taken from a surveillance drone. And then you have the eyes looking out at you that are watching us, watching the border. And there's also personifies the border as a person that's a face that's cut in two, part of a body and a mind divided. It's an arresting image, as a friend said, and it jumps out at you as a cover. A true border, a true place of encounter, is by nature permeable. It is not like medieval armor, but rather like skin. Our skin does set a limit to where our body begins and where it ends, but if we ever close up our skin, we die. And this is the epigraph for the book. It's by a noted Cuban-American theologian, Justo Gonzalez, who's a Methodist, I believe. And he was teaching about border issues, and I got this quote from him, and he said I could use it for the book because this is the image of the border as a something that's not closed and not open, but there is a permeable barrier there, and it needs to stay that way. Okay. That's more the image that I'm looking for on the border as opposed to it being closed or being open, where there's a free exchange of people, ideas, goods, yet also where there is safety and security and everybody's rights and dignity is upheld. Okay. Oh, I should say that these are the photos that are in the book. They're in the book. They're all reproduced in black and white. So here we get a much better image of them. But I decided to write this book around the time Trump was elected, because he would, as you know, he went around saying he was going to build the wall, and this wall was already in existence, but then he was elected. So clearly all this imagery about the border being open or there not being a wall is very mischaracterization of what's actually going on the border. There's actually quite a security apparatus, a cordon of surveillance and walls and agents that's been there since the 1980s. So when Trump was elected, I decided I really needed to get back to writing about the border. I hadn't been doing any border writing for a while. And I started a blog in which I wrote some of the essays that later appeared in this book. And I was also struck by this image of the Emperor's New Wall, that the wall is already there, but everybody's saying that it isn't. And so I wrote this sort of fable that starts the book about the Emperor's New Wall, and it's a fable about the border being the special place, and then all these walls and security, and all these police came to the border to stop the smuggling that had been going on for thousands of years, migration and smuggling, and I didn't know what to do with it, because generally I write nonfiction, but this was this idea that had occurred to me, and then I was looking at a copy of Silent Spring, and I saw that it also started with a fable about what happens when the birds don't sing anymore, and it's called A Fable for Tomorrow. So I changed the title to A Fable for Tomorrow, and it's a direct reference to Silent Spring. So I don't know if anybody's going to get that, but that's that. Okay, this is what my friend Yolanda told me that really got me excited about writing the book. Her brother-in-law she's a Mexican woman who lives in Sonora, and I wrote about her stories previously in my previous book, Lives on the Line, which was my second border book. It was about lives of women workers and maquiladoras. And her brother had been killed by his stepson and members of the stepson's gang, and he didn't do anything wrong. He just showed up at his house, and they were there, and he left and came back later. They showed up later and just beat him to death. And so I was consoling Yolanda, and I said, "Oh, it must be so hard to stay brave." And she said, "No vale la pena," which means it's not worth it. Then she said, "The cementerios están llenos de los bravos." The cemeteries are full of brave ones. So I decided I really need to write this book. That's what really got me going. Okay, this is like a historical photo of Nogales, but it was only 1993, which makes me feel very old. But this is what the fence used to look like. The U.S. side is on the left there, and the Mexican side is on the right. And up until 6, the border was basically pretty much open. You could cross through the fence in Nogales. During the sanctuary movement in the 1980s, there would be kids there. Starting in the 80s, arrests peaked at around the year 2000. There was 1.7 million, and then they started to decline. And so for many years, the arrests kept going, the number of migrants trying to cross kept going down and down and down, but the cordon of security kept going up. And then there's been a couple of surges of migrants. In 2014, there was a bunch of unaccompanied minors during the Obama administration. And that's when they first started opening these shelters for unaccompanied minors that still exist now, that I visit in the book. I talk about a visit to one of these shelters. And then Obama was deporting a lot of people too, because they were trying to get an immigration deal with the Republicans. So they said, "Oh, if we deport, we'll have this big effort to round up and deport undocumented people, then they will agree to immigration reform." But that never happened, because in Washington, I think having the border as a political issue is more important than actually solving the problem. Okay, so this is what the wall around Nogales looks like now. These are 30, this is probably 20 feet tall with then metal plates on the top, and then this big surveillance tower. This is also taken from the US side, and then you can see the house on the Mexican side. So this is probably taken just a couple of years ago. The U.S. government, after 9/11, even though none of the 9/11 terrorists came through Mexico, there was even more security crackdown. And then they passed this law that allowed the government to ignore environmental and cultural protection laws when it was building fences on the border. And this has led to fences being built in some very remote areas, and it's been very damaging to the land and the wildlife out there. So people on the border are really upset about that. Also, Native Americans. There's a place called Quito by Quito Springs. That's like one of the few oases on the desert. And they built a wall very close. The wall goes right nearby it. And they were sucking up the groundwater to make concrete to pour the foundation for the wall. So there was a lot of concern that this natural spring that had been there for millennia is going to be destroyed in order to build this wall. And some Native American activists were arrested. There's been some protests of people climbing into the front loader, refusing to let the construction go forward. And a judge recently decided that she was exercising her religious beliefs. So there's been a little bit of protests and progress on that. Okay, here's this poster that there's a Comedor in Nogales, Sonora, a place where the migrants can come. And this has been a big problem, is that since the crackdown in the urban areas, people have been going out to the desert and they've been dying out there by the thousands. An estimated 10,000 people have died on the U.S. Mexico border since in the last 20 years. And these red dots mark where bodies have been found. And this poster is a little bit old, so there's been many more found since then. Okay, shall I continue on?
Just continue.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, this is a map that shows that they give out to migrants at a shelter in Nogales, Sonora, the Kino Border Initiative. It's run by the Jesuits, and they serve thousands of people a year there, helping them before they cross or when they're deported, or they just serve migrants in Nogales. So this map is made by Humane Borders, which puts water stations out in the desert, and then they also do GPS coordinates of all the bodies that have been found. And there's been, as I said, about 10,000 bodies found in the last 20 years. Most of them, a lot of them are unidentified, and there's been an organization called the Colibri Center for Human Rights that does forensic analysis and tries to reunite unknowns, desconocidos, with their families. So that's a lot of big work, that humanitarian work that's going on the border now, is trying to care for migrants and also to care for their bodies and their loved ones, because a lot of times these people are never reunited with their families. Okay, do you see the slide now of the Border Patrol agents kicking over the water?
Yes.
Okay, this was a video that was secretly recorded by a group called No More Deaths. And it caused a big sensation when it came out, I guess the beginning of 2018, because it showed Border Patrol agents destroying food and water that had been left for migrants, and also taunting and threatening volunteers and pouring out water in front of them. But the afternoon after this video was released, the Border Patrol went and arrested this guy, Scott Warren, who has been helping migrants. And he was put on trial, and it was the first major smuggling trial since the sanctuary movement. This was a couple years ago, that he used his religious beliefs as a defense, that it required him to help migrants. And they had also tried that in the sanctuary movement, but it didn't work. The sanctuary workers were all convicted, or almost all. But in this case, there was a hung jury, and then the judge convicted him no, in the Warren case, he was acquitted. He was ultimately acquitted. But there's been a bunch of other cases where people have been charged with littering and trespassing and abandoning property in a wilderness area, and crimes like that for leaving food and water in the desert. Those cases are still ongoing, although one judge in Tucson recently wrote that the government seems to be saying they're interfering with a policy of deterrence by death, which is a pretty strong statement for a judge, because that's what the activists have been saying all along, that all the security on the border is driving people out into the desert where they're dying. So we have this paradoxical situation where the Border Patrol is often in the position of saving people's lives, but they wouldn't be having to save their lives if they hadn't been driven out there in the first place. Okay, do you see that? Do you see this one? Central American migrants?
Yes, just assume we see them unless we tell you otherwise.
Okay. Okay, this picture was taken by a friend of mine. This was the last big migrant surge, which happened under Trump. It kind of seemed to have taken everybody by surprise. A bunch of Central American families arrived at the border, and they camped out there for days and months because they had this metering policy where you couldn't apply for asylum. You had to sit, wait for days. And then they instituted this Remain in Mexico policy. And so there's now currently 75,000 migrants or more in camps in Mexico that are waiting to have their asylum claims heard. And they are hearing a few of them. My friends who run migrant shelters here in Tucson say they're, a couple hundred people a day are coming through the shelters now. And since they're going to be undoing Title 42, or there's talk that they're going to undo it, they're getting ready for another surge. And we can talk about that in a little while. I guess I should speed up because I've had so many technical glitches. Okay, this is the old comedor where the people are waiting out front to be served lunch. They've gotten enough money to build a new one right across the street. But for many years, this was it. It was just this tiny little place that helped so many people. Okay, and this is El Jefe. There's a whole chapter in the book about wildlife, the impact of wildlife on border security. And also there's a mine under construction near here called Rosemont that is going to level these really beautiful mountains. And so there's been a huge fight over that because it's not that far from Tucson. It's, about 30 miles down the road. They found that they were very surprised that jaguars were coming into the United States. They used, camera traps, remote cameras to researchers, ironically using funding from studying the impact of border security. So that's how they found that jaguars were coming as far as 60 miles into the United States, right where they're going to build this mine. So this jaguar El Jefe, there used to be jaguars all over the southwestern United States, but they were exterminated due to predator bounty programs and things like that. But there still is a viable population in Sonora in Mexico, and I write about that a little bit in the book, that these wildlife corridors across the border need to stay open. And some of these more recent fences that Trump has built have been very harmful because they go way out into remote areas. And can you still see me?
Yes.
Can you see the picture, the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, can you see this one?
Yes.
Okay, this is something I write about towards the end of the book. I'm writing about positive things that are happening on the border. And this is another work of art by the artist JR, who did the picnic on the cover, of a giant baby. He's about 30 feet tall, made like a poster or a billboard over the border, leaning over the border fence. And it was made near Tecate, California, at the same time he did the picnic. It's on the cover. And so in this part of the book, I also talk about other positive things that are happening on the border in terms of healthcare and food security, peace and nonviolence. There was a talk by Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr., who was in the AFSC, was a lunch counter protester. He marched with Martin Luther King. He worked with Bayard Rustin. He's probably in his 80s by now. And he came and spoke about Kingian nonviolence and the border, in which he talked about when Martin Luther King came to Tucson twice. He had been denied a motel room in Phoenix the night before, and he talked about that during his visit here. This was in the late 1950s. and he met with Native Americans, and he talked about how the Tucson community was the kind of community that he wanted to encourage, because he wanted to encourage coalitions with different kinds of groups. And then Dr. Lafayette also talked about the mountaintop in Tucson. He said that was the mountain that King had in mind. Talked about the mountains surrounding our beautiful city. Okay, and this is the last photo in the book, and I'd like to just read the last paragraph of the book, and then we can have some questions. The mountaintop in Tucson is what King had in mind. His reference to the mountaintop reminded me of my drive down to Patagonia the previous February. The road had wound along the eastern flank of the Santa Rita Mountains, not yet spoiled by the Rosemont mine. Several Border Patrol vehicles passed by, going in both directions. The checkpoint on the opposite side of the road, heading north, was manned by a dozen or more agents. Then the big new Border Patrol station at the Sonoyta Crossroads came into view. U.S., Arizona, and Border Patrol flags flapped on 3 separate poles out front. Parked in the adjoining lot and surrounded by a razor wire-topped fence were scores of brand new, bright white, dog catcher type SUVs. I slowed to count them. There were at least 150. The sight was formidable, but as I looked south toward Mexico, the rows of vehicles were dwarfed by the Patagonia Mountains lining the horizon. The towering, jagged peaks put the enormity and futility of the Border Patrol's task into perspective. The goal of a peaceful border, a border where so much death and suffering no longer occurred, loomed as great and mysterious and eternal as the mountains themselves. They filled my field of vision, yet as I approached, seemed to recede into the sky, as if containing a treasure forever out of reach. They were symbols of the peaceable kingdom, God's paradise, right here on earth between the United States and Mexico. Okay, sorry for all the technical glitches. I could answer some questions if anybody has any.
Miriam, can you tell us about the mines that you said they're going to take away the mountains? Is that for mining?
Yes. There's been a huge controversy here over a mine called the Rosemont Mine. It's actually owned by a Canadian company. And it hasn't been built because it's been held up in court for many years, because they are planning to level the Santa Rita Mountains, a significant portion of these mountains that are just south of Tucson. And they're very scenic, they're very beautiful, and they're between Tucson and if you drive down to the border near Bisbee or Douglas, you'll go by them. And that's where they found that jaguar. So that the presence of the jaguar they've been able to hold up the construction of the mine, but they're still bound and determined to build it. They've been good corporate citizens in Tucson, giving a lot of money. Say there's a lot of mining around here in Arizona. And what they do is they level these mountains because, hard rock mining, it's too hard to get at the copper. But, if they find there's enough copper, they just, they do open pit mining is what I mean. They basically turn the mountain inside out and make these big piles of sterile dirt that are very toxic. So currently the mine on the east side of the Santa Ritas is held up in court. So now they say they're going to mine on the west side of the Santa Ritas, which is the side you see when you're driving down to Nogales. So anyway, there's another big fight about a mine called Oak Flat. That again, some Native American, it's land that was set aside for Native Americans. It's another in a beautiful spot outside Phoenix. I mean, pretty, over near Globe and Morenci, they're in sort of east central Arizona is where there's a lot of mining going on. And it's controversial because it does provide jobs for the local people, and they're depressed areas, and these mines have a lot of money, and so the big government supports them. But local government, at least in Tucson, has been very opposed to this Rosemont mine, but we're not able to prevent it because the Forest Service, there's this law called the 1872 Mining Act that pretty much lets anybody, if you can prove there's minerals under the ground, they will let you mine it.
I'm wondering what, with a 30 years experience,
Yes.
if you can tell us how your impression and knowledge of the border has changed.
Yeah, well, as I said, it's been 30 years of wall building and 30 years of crackdowns and 30 years of militarization. It's been very harmful because we've seen that migration is just not one of these problems that responds to law enforcement, because people have to migrate and they will do it whether we try to kill them or not. And it's very similar to drug addiction, which is another big issue on the border because of all the ostensible reason for the crackdown is to stop drug smuggling. And yet here we have, record high overdoses. We have the Sackler family. I really believe that these are supply and demand issues that, beyond a certain level of law enforcement, drug addiction is a social problem. It's an internal United States problem. And to turn these foreign countries into militarized places like we've seen in Colombia and Mexico, narco states, because there's so much money. So that's why I draw these parallels with alcohol prohibition on the border, that the more you crack down on the border, the more production moves elsewhere, or they'll come in through Canada, just like we've seen with migrants freezing to death on the Canadian border or drowning off the coast of Florida. I mean, even if they sealed the Mexican border, we would still be seeing these issues. So what I'm hoping is that we're going to start, now that we've tried that, sealing the border is the response to these problems, that we will start looking for other solutions. And that's kind of why I wrote this book, to try to educate people about the border, how the border is not causing these problems, and how cracking down on the border is not solving them.
Are there any other questions? We have plenty of time.
I have a question.
Yes.
Over in Waldo County, we are doing a Waldo County Reads project this year, and the book that we're reading is The Devil's Highway by Luis Alberto Rivera. Urea.
Urea is his name.
Urea.
Urea, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I know Luis, who's actually at the book fair.
Okay. So my question to you is, buried sort of in 3/4 of the way through the book, he makes the statement that he thinks that the problem of immigration boils down to stupidity of policy on both sides of the border. And I'm curious to know if you think that is really the real root cause, and where do we go from here? How are we going to change that in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I really try to answer that in my book, where I'm talking about what border people are doing to lead the way. And one is we are arguing that we can handle this flow of migrants, that it's not a unsolvable problem by any stretch. There's a lot of talk with Biden undoes Title 42. There's going to be another flood of migrants, but the mayor of Tucson, Regina Romero, was on NPR last week saying, we've handled floods before. We have the capacity. Just give us the resources. And anyway, we don't want to use words like flood because it's a gross mischaracterization of the situation. And especially if you compare to what's happening with the refugees from Ukraine. They are appearing on the border and they're going to the front of the line, which is fine, they should, but everybody else should be heard too. And everybody else is fleeing similar circumstances. So I'm hoping that the situation in Ukraine will open people's hearts a little more to these the plights of refugees on the border. There's other things that Quakers and activists are doing, which is stopping the flow of guns to Mexico. There's a program that AFSC supports called Stop U.S. Guns to Mexico, or Global Exchange, I guess. And this guy, John Lindsay Poland, is working on that issue. I write about that in the book. And some politicians as well are working on the flow of guns to Mexico. Also, as I said, the whole drug war needs to be rethought, and I think that's what we're doing. So those are the ways that we stop these problems on the border, is by dealing with these situations in a way that, and I think the Mexican government has for a long time been arguing for similar things. But the Mexican government is very corrupt as well. I'm not saying the Mexican government is to be defended in all cases. He's been very bad on the issue of journalists being murdered. AMLO, the president of Mexico, has basically attacks journalists verbally. And there's been a big problem with that. That's another issue I talk about. But again, a lot of this is tied to the narco culture and the corruption. And these are things that could be solved if we had a more rational policy towards drugs and migrants. Okay, anybody else?
I have a question. I'm wondering if there's any agreement that not just drugs, but it's climate change is also the reason for recent immigration.
Yes. Yeah, and that's kind of, it's definitely true. In Central America, they're really getting hit because it's an earthquake zone. There's frequently hurricanes there. So even if you can't, point to like direct cause and effect between environmental, climate change and migrants, it's definitely true that they've been hit a lot. There was a big volcano in Guatemala a few years ago, and a bunch of people came because of that, and because their crops were destroyed. And people come for push and pull factors much more than they are affected by the level of security on the border. That's just something they're not even thinking about. I think until they get here, a lot of these migrants from Venezuela and Cuba, they think they're going to be welcomed because they're anti-communist. But we do see a real racial disparity on the border between what happens with lighter skinned migrants and darker skinned ones. And that's happening all over the world too. But yeah, that's definitely a factor, climate change. And so, yeah, this is another thing that's going to keep happening.
Miriam, my beloved daughter that came along after 5 brothers, I want you to talk about the word beloved that you put in the title, because there's such horror in the book and all the things you explain, which you did very well without acting horrified. Make us understand how much you love the people, the simple, beautiful people like Yolanda who live along the border, and how much we can learn spiritually from the people who are just staying there, just living their lives, not being part of any of these horrors. How much we can learn from that, and about your love.
Thanks, Mom. Hi there. Yeah, well, what I describe in the book is that it's a place of great hope for people. They're coming here with their hopes and dreams of starting a new life. And like Yolanda came to the border to work in the factories there from her village. And even though it's a tough place, there is a lot of youthful energy. There's a lot of people not giving up. There's a lot of just stuff I write about, hope for the future. And it is a sad book. There is a lot of sadness in it, a lot of sad parts. But I think everybody is having sadness in their lives because of these issues. I mean, we're all so upset about what's happening in Ukraine and the border, and I'm really sad about how they use the border as a political tool to make people afraid. And when we should be having a much more kind and welcoming attitude towards migrants. So I'm hoping that this will be an example to people. That's what I write about in the book, that border people can lead the way for our nation to deeper understand. The beloved community is an international community, as Martin Luther King said.
And your book, can it be bought on Amazon or the University of Arizona Press?
Yes, both. Yes, it's available on Amazon and wherever books are sold.
I have a comment. I understand that people from Central America, which didn't have that name not so long ago, have been coming for thousands of years north. Cahokia is a remnant of that in Missouri. And there is also in Southern Ohio, there's the Snake Mound, among other remnants of civilizations. They think may even be Maya. So migration, I think, is something that's happened everywhere. I mean, we're all on native land here, and we all had immigrants in our background. How do you think that this is different?
Yeah, I agree. That's exactly what it is. It's migration. You know, that's what people do, and they always have, and they always will. And up until they built this big cordon of security, announced that the border was going to be sealed off, it wasn't, you know, an issue. Even, I mean, Mexican workers have been coming to work in California, and for, you know, they were welcomed. They went down there and recruited them. And then they were all sent back, rounded up and sent back during Operation Wetback. So these communities are well established. You go to many places in the Western United States, everybody there is Spanish speaking, like the grocery store and agricultural areas. And in Canada, you know, there's communities, like sending and receiving communities. So when I would interview migrants, they would frequently say, you know, I've been in the States for 10 years, 15 years, I have a family, and then they just rounded me up and deported me. So this situation is considerably different from the way it was up until the late 1980s. So my point is that it doesn't have to be this way. You know, it can be, we can deal with migration in a more rational and humane way. And I'm hoping that we can get to that, although we're still very much, it's being used as a political tool to scare people and say these migrants are, you know, I don't know, taking your jobs or causing crime or whatever it is. But the statistics all show that they are, you know, do jobs that Americans don't want, that we need their labor. And I think we need their labor to such an extent that that the policy is going to change. Also, because I think the next generation is much more able to deal with this. The young people today are just, I don't think they buy into a lot of this fear mongering that previous generations have. Anyway, I hope so.
So if we have no more questions, any comments from anybody?
Okay, I just say one more thing, which is I really appreciate all the work that Quakers are doing, that all you have done. And I write about Quaker activism on the border, nonviolent social activism on the border, and also in our own communities. So thank you so much for listening to me. I'm so sorry about the technical problems. And thank you so much for all the work that you all do in your communities to bring about a better world.
Thank you, Miriam.